All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into two things that seem, well, kind of separate at first glance. We've got, on the one hand, student protests that have, totally brought Barnard College to a halt. And then on the other, we've got President Trump back in the White House and shaking things up with the press pool. So to make sense of all this, we've got a whole bunch of sources, news reports, we've got official statements, we've even got a timeline. But our mission here isn't just to, relay the news, right? Is to help you understand the nuances, the why behind everything, and what it all means in the bigger picture.
Yeah, it's really interesting how both of these stories, even though they're happening in such different places, they touch on these core ideas, freedom of expression, access to information, and then how those can clash with the desire for control or order.
Exactly. So let's start with that scene at Barnard College. Imagine this.
Yeah.
Masked protesters, a sit-in that goes on for hours. Even a college employee ends up in the hospital. It's been pretty wild on campus.
And this wasn't out of nowhere. There's been tension building, especially at Columbia University, which is right next door, for a while now. And a lot of it revolves around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Last year at Columbia, we saw protests escalate like crazy. There were tent encampments. They even took over some buildings, all driven by demands for the university to divest from companies that support Israel.
Now, for anyone who's not familiar with that term, divestment in this case means putting pressure on institutions to pull their investments from companies that are, seen as complicit in the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. It's a tactic that's been used in a bunch of social justice movements, and it's definitely, it's controversial.
Totally. It sparks these huge debates about, academic freedom, what role universities should play in political stuff, and it even gets into the whole nature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict itself.
Yeah, for sure. So at Barnard, this recent blow up was triggered by the expulsion of two students. They disrupted a class on Israeli history at Columbia University. But it's important to note, this wasn't just a random thing. Apparently over 50 students had already been disciplined for pro-Palestinian activism before this even happened.
Right, and the protesters had some pretty clear demands. They wanted those expulsions reversed, amnesty for any student disciplined for pro-Palestinian activism. And they wanted a meeting with Barnard's dean, Dean Greenidge, and the president, President Rosenberry. They wanted their voices heard at the top.
But then things went a step further. Yeah. A smaller group of protesters allegedly forced their way into Milbank Hall and got into it with a Barnard employee. The employee ended up in the hospital, and that's when Barnard officials came out with some pretty strong statements.
Yeah, and it's interesting. They didn't just say they condemned the violence. They were worried about the immediate safety of everyone, of course. But they were also worried about the effect this could have on free speech on campus, making people afraid to speak their minds. They kept saying how important open dialogue is, but they were also drawing a line against violence and intimidation.
It sounds like they were trying to walk this fine line, recognizing the students' right to protest, but also making sure everyone on campus is safe. So did the protests accomplish anything?
Well, the sit-in, which lasted for over 6 hours, did get the students a small win. Barnard administrators agreed to meet with them to talk about their demands. Whether that actually leads to any changes, we'll have to see. But it definitely shows how powerful persistent protests can be, even when it comes to these really divisive issues.
All right, so we've got students fighting to be heard on campus. Now let's switch gears over to the White House, where President Trump is back and making some changes to how the press operates around him.
And to get what's happening here, we need to understand the White House press pool. It's this small group of journalists that represent the whole press corps. They get access to events in areas where space is limited, like the Oval Office or when the president travels. Traditionally, it's been the White House Correspondents Association, the WHCA, that's run this pool. They decide who gets a spot, so to speak.
So it's a system to make sure the media has some access, even when the whole press corps can't be there. But it sounds like that's changing under President Trump. What's he doing differently?
He's taking more control. The Trump administration is now deciding who's in and who's out of the press pool, and they say it's about giving power back to the people. But a lot of critics see it as a way to limit coverage from outlets that are critical of the administration.
That's concerning, right? I mean, a free press is supposed to be essential to a democracy. So if the administration is picking and choosing who gets access, doesn't that make it harder for the press to hold them accountable?
Exactly. And this worry is even bigger because some major news organizations were left out of Trump's first cabinet meeting since he came back. We're talking about Reuters, the Associated Press, HuffPost, even Der Tagesspiegel, which is a big German newspaper.
Wow, that's a pretty big list.
Yeah.
Any idea why these specific outlets were targeted?
Well, with HuffPost, some people think it's because a few weeks ago, one of their reporters asked President Trump some tough questions.
And didn't HuffPost also publish that article criticizing the press pool changes? And they had that image of President Trump.
Oh, yeah, the one that said 100% chicken. That definitely didn't help them with the administration.
No kidding. So we've got HuffPost maybe sidelined for asking tough questions. What about the others?
The Associated Press case is kind of strange. They were reportedly barred because they wouldn't call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, which is a term President Trump likes.
It sounds almost funny, but it's also a little unsettling. It makes you wonder how they're deciding who gets press access and if it's really fair or if they're just trying to silence dissent.
Exactly. And this isn't just a Trump thing. Remember, the Biden administration made changes in 2023, too. Over 440 reporters lost their White House credentials because they weren't going to the White House regularly.
So both administrations have tried to control who covers them in their own ways. It seems like there's a pattern here, even if the reasons are different.
And to make it even more complicated, the Trump administration says they're going to give back those press passes that were taken away under Biden. It's back and forth, with each administration reacting to what the last one did.
It's like a game of chess,
Yeah.
and the press is stuck in the middle. You know, as we're talking, I'm struck by how both of these situations, the student protests and the press pool changes, are about this tension between control and freedom. On one side, you have these institutions, a university and the White House, trying to keep things orderly and manage information. And on the other, you have individuals, students, and journalists pushing back, demanding more transparency and accountability.
It's a fascinating dynamic, and it reflects what we're dealing with in this information age. How do we balance the need for order with these essential freedoms that are supposed to be part of a democracy? How do we make sure information flows freely, but also protect against misinformation and manipulation? Those are the questions at the heart of both of these stories. And those are the questions we'll keep digging into as we go deeper into these sources in the next part of our deep dive. So, picking up on that whole control versus freedom thing, it's important to realize that what Trump's doing with the press pool, it's not totally new.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, think back to what we were saying about Biden's changes to the press pool. Remember how a lot of reporters lost their credentials? The reasoning was different, right? Biden's team was all about making sure reporters were consistently at the White House, but the end result was kind of similar. The number of reporters with regular access got smaller.
So maybe there's a trend here. Are all presidents, no matter what party they're from, getting more, assertive about who covers them?
That's a good question, and it's probably being debated like crazy right now by journalists and people who study politics. You got to think about the history here. For a long time, the WHCA, they played this big role in making sure the press pool was independent.
Like they were a buffer between the power of the White House and the press.
Exactly. But now that buffer's being challenged, maybe even taken apart, Biden and Trump, they've both tried to control who gets in their own ways.
It's almost like they're both saying, we get to choose who asks the questions.
Yeah, kind of. And that's a big deal for the information that gets out to the public. If most of the press pool is friendly to the administration, then critical voices might not get heard.
So this could be about controlling the story, about managing how people see the administration.
That's a real worry, and something we should all be aware of. This connects back to what's going on at Barnard, actually.
Oh yeah, let's get back to that. What could happen in the long run because of these protests and how the college responds?
Well, this could change the whole culture on campus, and how people talk about these complex issues like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
So it's bigger than just these students and what they're asking for. It's about the whole atmosphere at the college.
Exactly. It might make students on both sides more active. We could see more protests, more calls for divestment, maybe even more clashes.
And how could Barnard's response affect future protests? Like, if people think they gave in to the protesters, could that encourage more disruptive tactics later on?
Yeah, that's possible. But on the flip side, if they come down too hard, it could alienate students and make things even worse.
Sounds like Barnard's in a tough spot. They want to protect free speech and the right to assemble, but they also want to keep everyone safe. Finding that balance is hard, especially with these emotional, divisive issues.
And remember, all of this is happening in a world that's getting more and more polarized. We see it in politics, in the media, even in our own relationships.
It feels harder to have real conversations about difficult things without it getting heated or even hostile.
Oh, that's the challenge, right? How do we have thoughtful discussions, listen to different viewpoints, and find common ground when everything feels so divided?
Those are big questions, and I don't think there are easy answers, but I think we have to keep asking them.
Absolutely. Maybe by looking at situations like these, the protests and the press pool stuff, we can understand the challenges and opportunities better when it comes to this crazy information landscape we're all living in.
I keep thinking about how both these situations involve institutions, the university and the White House. They're dealing with the limits of control in a time when information is everywhere and people want more transparency.
That's a great point. These institutions are having to adapt to a world where their old ways of doing things and controlling communication are being challenged.
And the way these things play out will affect how we think about free speech, access to information, and even democracy itself in the 21st century.
Definitely. It's a constantly changing situation, and we all have to play a part in shaping how information is shared, debated, and how it shapes our view of the world.
So, as we wrap up this part, what should our listeners be thinking about? What's the one thing you want them to take away?
That's a great question. I think the biggest takeaway is this. We all have to be critical thinkers about information. Don't just accept what you hear or read. Question your sources, think about different viewpoints, and be open to having conversations, even when they're tough.
That's good advice. And with that, we'll move on to the last part of our deep dive. We'll share some more insights and leave you with something to think about. Stay with us.
We're back, and this whole conversation, it really makes you think about information, right? Like who's in control of it, who gets to shape it, and how that affects how we see the world.
It's so relevant, especially these days. There's just so much information coming at us from everywhere. It's hard to figure out what's real and what's not.
It really does. It feels like we're in this ocean of information, and we can get pulled in any direction.
Exactly. And that's where critical thinking is super important. We can't just absorb everything. We got to question it, think about it, analyze it, look for biases. So instead of just believing what we see, we need to be more, skeptical.
Yeah, like a detective almost. Gather the evidence, look at different sides, and then make up our own minds based on the facts.
And that makes me think about how institutions like universities or the government, they play a big role in all this. They have a lot of power over what information gets out there and how it's presented.
You're right, and that's why a free press is so important. They keep those institutions in check, hold them accountable, and give us different perspectives.
Which brings us back to the White House. If they can control who talks to the president and what they can ask, it could really change how the public sees things.
For sure. It raises questions about transparency and accountability. If we only hear one side, it's hard to know what to believe.
It makes you wonder if these changes to the press pool are like a sign of things to come, where information is more and more restricted and controlled by those in power.
That's a tough one to answer, but it's definitely something to watch.
So where does that leave us? What can we as individuals do to navigate all this and find accurate, unbiased information?
That's the question I really want people to think about. In a time when we're overloaded with information and power dynamics are always shifting, how can we be responsible? How can we make sure we're getting the whole picture, not just a story someone wants us to hear?
It's a big challenge, but we can't ignore it. Our democracy depends on it.
Perfectly said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We hope it's given you some things to think about. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.